Hello everyone, welcome to attend this very first webinar for our 2021 BERA CERA Academic Publishing Webinars. It is co-hosted by the BERA Early Career Researcher Network and also the Chinese Educational Research Association. So in this series, we have 3 webinars. This one is the first on academic publishing from senior researchers' perspectives. Our second webinar will be hosted on the 4th of June, and it is about academic publishing from an early career researcher network. So please visit BERA's website to register if you are interested for that one. For today's webinar on academic publishing from a senior researcher's perspectives, we are very honored to have invited Professor Pat Thompson from the School of Education at University of Nottingham to be our first speaker. Professor Pat Thompson has been a strong advocate for supporting researchers' academic writing alongside her other work on, for example, creativity and arts in education. So I'm sure many of you attending this webinar today might have already read a lot of Pat's blogs before. So we are really looking forward to hearing about Pat's perspectives on academic publishing. Now let's hand over to Pat and welcome her to give her talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to present some ideas to you today about academic writing. And I just quickly to start with, I'm just going to go through some of the, I guess, the order of what I'm going to do today, so you know what to expect. I'm going to start with a few kind of caveats about academic writing and publishing and this presentation, in fact. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about challenges related to writing and types of writing that you might have to do and the various readers that you're going to encounter. I want to talk about developing a publication agenda and writing a journal article and, of course, dealing with critique. And if we have time, I'll talk about writing the book of the PhD, but we may not actually get to that. So let me start by, I guess, offering, it is a very big caveat, really, which is to say that, you know, I was asked to present today with the viewpoint of a senior researcher. And of course, our experiences as senior researchers are very different to people who are doing their PhD today or people who, you know, already have perhaps found an academic job or are in some kind of precarious work. And in a lot of ways, I think you should take what we say with a large grain of salt, because we certainly shouldn't be extrapolating from our own experience to yours. Because it's so different. But I think our understandings even of the world that you inhabit may, you know, are inevitably coloured by who we are and where we are. So, you know, do take what I'm going to say, interrogate what I'm going to say from the perspective of your experience. That's a kind of an invitation to be sceptical about anything that I say to you today. I do want to say also that, you know, it's important, I think, to begin any talk on academic publishing to say that one of the things I think, you know, I probably would stand by is the way in which PhD trajectories have changed really dramatically. And, you know, in what is often, you know, sociologists might talk about the knowledge society, some people call it a knowledge economy. I prefer to think about it as a kind of democratization of places and processes for cultivating knowledge. You notice I would use the word cultivation here and not production, so I'm deliberately moving away from a particular kind of language around what it is that we do as scholars. And I think that thinking about the kind of changing landscape of where it is that knowledge is nurtured and cultivated is important, not only at the end of the PhD, but actually during it. So thinking about, whether in fact you see yourself inside or outside higher education. There's lots of places outside higher education now where people do the same kind of knowledge work that we do inside universities, and it's quite possible to move in between inside and outside higher education. And I've done that myself. I didn't start out in higher education. I started out in schools, and like a lot of people in education faculties in particular, I came into an education faculty after a rather long time in schools, actually. But understanding, I think, that there are different ways and places that you can use the practices that you've built up during your PhD, including writing and publishing, is something that you've got to think about. And I think one of the interesting things now is the ways in which we often work in partnerships between universities and other institutions where there are people with the same kinds of scholarly backgrounds and same kind of scholarly attributes that we have, and something that anthropologists call epistemic counterparts. We're not the sole possessors of knowledge about scholarship. I work a lot with people in the museum and gallery sector, as you heard in the introduction, and there are lots of people in museums and galleries now that have doctorates, and in fact, read exactly the same kind of books that I do, read academic journals, and read a range of other things as well. So, I think it's to understand the kind of changing landscape, which also includes, I think, new demands on us to make our research more accessible. And so when we think about publication, we're not just thinking, of course, about academic books and journal articles and book chapters. We're also thinking about the range of other publications that it might be good to do as well, ranging from things like blogs, online newspaper, like The Conversation, to YouTube, to Instagram. There's all kinds of opportunities, professional magazines, particularly in education, lots of other places that we have to think about in relation to the writing and publication that we do. And when we do whatever writing we do, we're always thinking, whether it's for an academic journal or whether we're thinking about writing for The Conversation, we're always thinking about who's reading this publication, and therefore what do we want to say in order that they might take up the knowledge that we've been engaged in presenting to them. And one of the big decisions I think we all have to make now is how openly accessible our work is. Lots of big conversations about open access, about the economic politics of academic publishing. And I think we have to position ourselves, and often individually, but sometimes collectively, in relation to those really difficult questions, actually, about, if we really want particular groups of people to read our work, is the best place to put it in an academic journal, which is paywalled. On the other hand, if you want to work in higher education, then you've got to have some of that in order to actually get the kind of CV that might get taken seriously. So, these are not easy kinds of questions, and I'm not suggesting that they are, but I do want to put on record at the start that I understand any kind of conversation about academic publishing and writing agendas happens in a context, and this is the kind of context that we're all working in, but you in particular face particular pressures, and one of them is likely to be about how fast you can actually write. And there's lots of conversations about slow scholarship, about performative agendas where crunching out output, and quite unrealistic kind of expectations, I think, in some places about the amount of work that you can actually produce, particularly if you're doing contract or other kinds of precarious bits of work, stitching together jobs, working for other people as a contract researcher. It's hard to do your own work at the same time, and also, of course, negotiate, if you're working for other people, for ways to actually publish with them as well. So there's lots of kind of issues, I think, in the context that are really tricky. I think the other kind of bit of context that I just want to recognise is that the whole process of, the doctorate itself has also changed, as has early career work within a university. And it's increasingly the case, it used to be just the kind of supervisor or supervisors and the PhD who were kind of, responsible for what happened. And now we've got grad schools, we've got all kinds of workshops, we've got learned associations like BERA who are offering different kinds of opportunities and resources to people. And there's also an enormous amount of stuff which is online now. And it's a variable quality. This is, as an educational sociologist, what I'd probably call an unregulated market online. And, some of the kinds of ideas about writing that are very common in the academic writing advice that you see are often talked about as if they're kind of universally applicable. And then if you decide, to try one of these kind of strategies and it doesn't work for you, you're kind of left again feeling that it's probably you that's the problem, because this seems to work for everybody else, so why doesn't it work for you? And actually, I think it's most helpful to think about writing. I think in education, we've actually got a bit of a conceptual advantage here, because we understand that teachers, actually, whether they're teachers in schools or colleges or universities, teachers actually have a teaching repertoire. There isn't a one best way to teach. What you have as a teacher are a range of strategies and resources that you can call on, that you kind of adopt and adapt to the particular situation that you're in. And this is exactly how it is with writing and publishing as well. What we want to do, I think, the more we stay in a kind of academic context, either inside or outside university, is to build up our kind of writing and publishing repertoire. And so, I think approaching the advice as not as a set of one best solutions, but actually as a set of things that might be useful at some times in some places, is probably the way to approach this. But also, I think, to be wary of the kind of pathologizing and self-labeling that goes on about, inner editors, and I have an over anxious and hyperactive inner editor, for example, when in actual fact what you might just be doing is trying to write something that's really hard, and it's just taken a long time to actually get your head around what's required, and you've made lots of false starts on it because you haven't quite got the thinking right. That's not what having a hyperactive and over anxious inner editor actually means, although it could actually, I guess, appear as such if you just look at the phenomena. But I think understanding as well, not only that you need to build up a kind of repertoire, but also this is a learning process. And when you start any kind of learning process, or when you're engaged in a learning process, you often feel like, a fish out of water. You feel unskilled, you feel you don't know what you're doing, you feel like a bit of a fraud. So ideas like imposter syndrome, in fact, may obscure the fact that, what's happening here is that this is about learning, and this is perfectly ordinary and perfectly common for people to feel that they're not quite sure of what they're doing. And I think as educators, I think we can bring all that stuff that we know about learning and teaching to our own practices as writers. So they're my kind of the kind of caveats that I'd want to begin with. And now I want to go on to a couple of principles and challenges related to academic writing, which I think are also helpful kind of precursors. And I think one is to understand, firstly, that there are some things, it's not that helpful to think about writing by itself. So writing is actually, particularly in relation to scholarship, writing is part of the thinking process for us. And in fact, putting stuff out onto paper, firstly, it might be notes, it might be half-formed sentences, it might be bits and bobs of paragraphs, it might be attempts at papers, it might be a conference paper. This is all part of the process of us actually thinking through the kind of problems and or the stuff that we've accumulated, that's the writing is part of that process. You know, we don't just, as the phrase writing up suggests, have a kind of fully formed theory of something or a set of results, which we then can just simply write up as if it's no trouble at all. We actually continue the thinking and the analysis while we're writing up, and we very often, you know, start the process with writing as well. And the second thing, of course, is that as we're writing, I mean, and this is a kind of Judith Butler sort of point, really, that, you know, as we're writing, we're actually writing ourselves as scholars as well. So our writing very much, and what we write and how we write is very much about the scholar that we want to be. So and that ranges from the way that we write our sentences to the people that we cite, to the way in which we structure our papers, the efforts that we make to find voice, to express ourselves clearly. They're all about becoming a particular kind of scholar. And of course, we're always in the process of becoming. So even someone who's as elderly as me is still being formed as a scholar through my writing. It's not the only way that I form myself. You know, obviously we form ourselves through interactions, through talking, through reading and whatever, but writing is really an important part of the way that we produce ourselves, and it's the way that we know other people. We often know people through their texts. We're often communicating with people that are no longer alive, but they are alive in their texts. So we're having this kind of in-depth conversation with a text which represents a kind of a scholarly life and a scholarly endeavour. And of course, we're engaging with in this, as we engage, we're also now being evaluated. It's not simply that we know other people's work and we make those kind of evaluative judgments we make in literature reviews. We're actually now institutionally evaluated as well on the text. And as PhDs, of course, you're going to be examined on the text. But you know, that process continues. We are continually evaluated, and that's where the kind of question about critique and becoming, forming, I guess, a kind of process of dealing with critique is important. There's obviously lots of different kinds of texts that, as I've pointed out, and we do have to be, you know, kind of multilingual to actually deal with these texts. It's not that there's one way to write academically. So as scholars, as we write these multiple texts, we're presenting ourselves in a range of different kind of genres and styles. And of course, the really interesting issue is that, you know, your texts kind of go out into the world and then people interpret them. And while it's interesting, of course, and thrilling to get your first kind of citations, it's always a bit odd to actually understand that the text has a life of its own separate from you, and people read into it the most peculiar things. And I certainly had the experience the other day where I read a paper where someone had cited among a bunch of other people something that I'd written, and I thought, you haven't read this at all. You've only actually read the title and made an assumption about what's inside it. And in fact, what was inside was exactly what the paper was arguing. So, you know, there's kind of interesting things that happen to your text out in the world, and you know, what people make of you and your texts is always interesting. But I think thinking about the process of what kind of scholar that you're wanting to become is important at early on in the kind of academic writing process, because during the doctorate and also afterwards, we're all in that process of moving from a kind of an undergraduate to postgraduate student, you know, to actually someone who writes with authority, to someone who writes and claims their expertise in an academic sense. And in education, of course, many of us are already kind of professional experts, if you like, when we come into education, and we have this bizarre kind of juggle of, you know, in the profession, I'm perceived to, you know, as some kind of authority. Over here in the academy, you know, I feel like a beginner all over again. And the trick, of course, part of the trick in the thesis is to actually write it as if you are, you know, the world's greatest authority on the topic, even though at that stage you mightn't feel like it. So there's often a disjunction between how you actually feel about the self, the scholarly self, and what you actually have to do in the text. And part of that is really unlearning. It's a lot of unlearning of all the things that got you into the doctorate in the first place. You know, writing an essay in a thesis is really not helpful. And a lot of people sometimes do write quite essay-like, you know, things when they're talking about their methodology or they're talking about the literature, you know, whereas what's wanted is a kind of very, authoritative is the word really, walk through and steer through the literature and an explanation of why it is that you've done particular kinds of things. And I think the other challenge in moving from kind of the student to the expert does focus around this question of critique that, you know, even in masters and in some of the doctoral coursework that you do in this country, which is, you know, necessary to go on to the PhD, you still have to write kind of essays where you get marked kind of right and wrong, really. You know, of course, in academic publishing, there isn't any right and wrong. There is interpretation, which can be variously interrogated and critiqued, appreciated, evaluated, cited, loved, etc. So it's moving from that kind of right-wrong student environment for the way that your work is received to this kind of scholarly conversation and the scholarly critique that goes on. The other principle that I think is really important to understand is that, you know, academic writing's not a kind of free-floating thing. It exists in a particular kind of disciplinary and institutional context, and there are a whole bunch of rules and conventions, some of which might be pretty inexplicit and not made clear, and, you know, that you're kind of expected to just sort of absorb by being in the place, by being, you know, by reading the journals, by reading the books. You're expected to kind of get on to what it is that you're meant to do within your particular part of the educational field. So that kind of creates some frames around what you can and can't do. There are also other kinds of things which influence what we write and how we write. You know, and I've already mentioned audit, for example, but also what it is, and that's certainly for those of you who aren't doctoral researchers, but who are early career staff members, those kinds of audit contexts are often really important. Thinking about how you know, if you're on a teaching only contract, for example, and you don't want to be, what kind of work you actually have to produce in order to make that kind of move across. If you're outside higher education and you want to come in, what kind of work do I have to be able to produce in order to be seen as, you know, and already an insider. So, you know, there's all of these, you know, often hidden kind of conventions and rules that shape what go on, and pressures and frames. And in the doctorate, it's the supervisor who, you know, is really meant to be a kind of guide about all of those things. And they also mediate. And sometimes, you know, what we do as supervisors is not necessarily always clear. Sometimes we often respond, you know, with tacit knowledge as opposed to a kind of explicit understanding of why we're saying, well, you know, this doesn't read right, or, you know, you might need to unpack this further, or, you know, there's more that sits behind those kinds of comments that are sometimes supervisors, sometimes we don't necessarily articulate well. And sometimes, you know, even people who are formally evaluating and examining the work also often work more what appears to be intuitively, but, you know, in education we'd understand this as kind of tacit knowledges, not fully articulated. And, you know, you can easily run foul of those, I think, if you haven't spent time quite deliberately thinking about what are the kind of frames, what are the expectations, and who's reading this, and, you know, what is it that they're going to expect me to actually do in this piece of writing. So, this is the kind of key question in relation to readers, because rhetorically, when we're writing something for publication, we're writing for a reader. I mean, a lot of the time when we do that kind of writing and thinking stuff, we're our first reader. We're writing for ourselves, and in fact, we're always reading what we're writing at the same time, and making kind of critical judgments about our writing as we go. But when we're thinking about publication, we do have to start to think about, who do we want to read our stuff? Who needs to read our stuff? That's not the same thing, and finding, and then there's a kind of task, I think, of finding out, if we've got this message to give and this is the reader we want to hear it, well, where can we put the stuff? How do we need to write it in order that they're going to take it seriously? What are those readers actually going to expect to see when we produce a piece of writing? Even if we're writing something for a kind of audit purpose, and that's the first thing in our mind, I've got to get this kind of paper in this journal, because it's, one that is going to look good on my CV. And I'm not suggesting that that's a great thing to do, but I understand it's something that a lot of people feel they have to do at present. You still got to go through the same process, even if there's more a kind of sense of dread or obligation when you're facing the kind of this kind of writing. You still have to think about the readers and their expectations, what it is they already know, and what that means for the way that you actually shape up the publication. So, and the kind of rules that are going to guide what it is that you write about, what kind of theories and intellectual resources you mobilise, and how it is you actually write the piece. So the old kind of thing about who's the reader is a really key question to consider. So let me just say a little bit more about how I think early on it might be helpful to think about publication. And I have a kind of particular view on this, and it's not necessarily going to be the same one that supervisors or other people that advise you are going to offer, because I often have people in workshops saying to me, I've been told to write in the most highly ranked journal that there is in my field. And and I want to get in the best journal. And I mean, often my question back to people is, does your supervisor publish in that journal? Surprisingly, a lot of them don't, but some of them of course do, and they may in fact be able to help you get into the very highly ranked journals. But it's starting out, I think the object is actually to get your stuff out there to the people that you want to read it. And I think they're the kind of questions that need to really be guiding what you publish. And, and you're looking for kind of journals that are what I would call decent journals, not necessarily the most highly ranked journals where you're going to wait for 2 years to get through the reviewing and revision kind of and publication process. But a journal which is probably handling things reasonably efficiently, where there's, I guess, a scholarly community that will be interested in what it is that you've got to say, and where it's a community that you're going to feel comfortable, where you can go to conferences, make connections, establish networks. And I do think that, solely looking at rankings and citation indices can be a terrible trap for people. And it's, as can solely thinking about audit kind of purposes. Obviously, as I've suggested, that some of that probably is necessary. I think it's also easy to be flattered by the, invitations to publish that you get, and we all get them. I mean, I get about half a dozen a week these days from somebody asking me to write something or other. And, it's easy to get distracted from your own agenda. Your object is to get published, and some of the invitations might be really helpful to you, but others might kind of steer you a bit off course and actually prevent you getting to your real stuff, the stuff you really want to get out there to the readers who you really want to talk with. And of course, a lot of those invitations are going to come from predatory journals as well. And I'm going to say just a touch about that later. But I think there's also, you know, some of those invitations are going to be opportunities. They are going to put you in the same kind of arena, the same space as other scholars in the field who you may not yet know. It may be that some of those invitations also carry opportunities to present at conferences, for example, and that often leads to good things. And quite often you might get a kind of conversation which could lead to an opportunity to co-author something. And I think some of these things are actually very helpful as well. So it's not simply about co-authoring with your supervisor, but co-authoring with, you know, another PhD or another early career researcher, putting the stuff that you've got together to make something that neither of you could write by yourselves, but actually together you can write something pretty damn good. So I think being open to invitations and open to co-authoring is good. And then I think being tempered about the way in which you approach questions like ranking and citations, remembering that the point of publishing is actually to get the stuff out there and being used and being and getting into conversations with other people, either asynchronously through publication or synchronously, either online or in conferences. That's really the goal. So with that in mind, I'm a very firm believer in people, as they're approaching the end of their PhD and early on, developing a kind of publication agenda and a publishing plan. And these can be very elaborated, or they can be, you know, relatively simple. But I think the key thing is firstly to think about, you know, what it is that you actually are going to be known for, you know. And this is interesting for people who are doing their PhDs. You know, you haven't often got past thinking about, well, I'm just going to pass the PhD, but project yourself now 5-10 years down the track and imagine that somebody is reading a body of stuff that you've written, you know, and actually play with this, you know, write your surname and the date, you know, 2 years hence, 10 years hence, and think about what it is that you're actually known for. I mean, you heard my kind of little bio introduction, you know, I've got some kind of claim in the arts and creativity area and probably in academic writing and maybe a couple of other things as well. But, you know, they're things that people know me by in my writing as well as what I write about myself. So think about yourself in that kind of situation and then think, what do I need to publish in order for somebody to be able to write that about me? You know, what are the things I've got to say about this particular topic that are going to allow me to build up a body of work that people will be interested in, that people want to refer to, that people want to use and build on in their own work. So, you know, having a look around at the PhD, the stuff on the cutting room floor that you didn't use in the thesis, you know, stuff that might connect with other people, new bits and pieces that you've done post the PhD, if that's where you are, you know, look at your teaching, look at some of the conversations you're having, look at some of the things that you're reading, look at media reports. You know, there's all sorts of stuff around that often connects with the empirical work that you've already done, that your empirical work will inform a look at. You know, think about all of that and see if you can, you know, get a sort of clump of things, of possible publications. And then I think, it's just a process of sort of sorting it out, thinking about, well, what do I need to do first of these? What's something that I'm going to be able to do without, kind of really having a terribly hard time, something that is going to be possible and achievable, something where there seems to be an audience, something where I can already think of a place it can go, something that will set the theme for the rest of the publications to come. Those kinds of questions, I think, then help you actually knock a big unassorted list into something like a timeline that you can actually then schedule and make into a plan. These things aren't fixed in stone, of course. They change as they go along, as perhaps you get an invitation that is helpful, or you find somebody else to work with, or it just seems that, now would be a good time to write this particular thing. So plans are not fixed in stone, but you can certainly do some work thinking about, what each of these publications are. You can write some little abstracts, you can generate some titles, you can actually feel as if you've got a body of work that's going to come out. And you can think about, as you're doing this, who it is that you're going to direct these publications for, so you can make sure there's some balance in the agenda between different kinds of readers to make sure the stuff is getting out. And at the end of this, I'm just going to put up a slide which has got 2 or 3 books that you might want to look at. And there is a kind of an exercise book, if you like, by Helen Cara and Janet Salmons in Helen's and my series, Routledge series, called Insider Guides. But they've written a book about developing a publishing plan, which has got quite structured exercises in it if you don't want to do the kind of more ad hoc version that I'm talking about here. But I think developing a plan is a really sensible thing to do, and it's good to kind of get it done early, remembering that it's really hard to squash the PhD into a journal article, so, and you probably want to write more than one. And secondly, thesis chapters don't necessarily translate easily into journal articles. You've got to think about what's the stuff, what are the ideas, what are the points that you've made, rather than I'm going to turn this chapter into a journal article. I've got this really interesting thing to say about X, which actually might appear in 2 or 3 chapters, which I can reassemble into a really good journal article. It's that kind of thing that you need to be able to do when you're thinking about what to publish. So here's a little question for you. Okay, are there any particular topics you'd like me to cover? Okay, well, that's a big agenda, which I'm obviously not going to do, but I am going to deal with rejection. I am going to talk about finding the right journal. I will talk about structure and argument, and those things relate together. I am going to talk about choosing a journal. So identifying the best journal, responding to critique. What belongs where is probably the same as structure. Okay, I think I'll be able to deal with some of that, but not all of it. And I think maybe the things that I don't do might be able to be carried on into the questions, or perhaps into some kind of conversation afterwards as well. I don't want to leave you all hanging. So let me start with choosing a journal. So I'd anticipated this one, you see. So, you'll understand already from what I've said that I think the key part of choosing a journal is actually choosing the readers. And it's helpful to think about a journal not simply as readers, but actually being a kind of scholarly community that are committed to growing knowledge about a particular topic. And they often have a particular attitude, if you like, or a particular stance or position in relation to research, but also in relation to the topic. And it is helpful, I think, to think of a journal as being a very long-term asynchronous conversation. And it's helpful, I think, to some of the areas, I think, to understand that the mission statements of journals don't necessarily tell you everything that you need to know about the journal. And that in some fields in education, there are quite fractious educational groups that are gathered around particular journals. So in educational leadership, for example, there are different journals catering for different ways of approaching educational leadership management and administration scholarship. There are also different journals, I think, around questions of language and literacy, for example, and for TESOL, English for academic purposes. There are various kinds of fairly defined conversations that often don't talk to each other, and where the journal communities are actually reasonably closed and not interested in someone who's going to come in and kind of offer a fresh perspective. And so it's as well, I think, to think about what Mary Jane Curry and Teresa Lillis talk about only in relation to people publishing in English whose first language is not English. I mean, they talk about the importance of having a publication broker, and I think actually having a publication broker is really helpful for everybody starting off. So it's good to have somebody actually talk you through the kind of internecine debates and divisions that there might be among journals. So, and because no one ever writes that down, but it sure as hell is there. And if you put something into the wrong journal, if it's a closed kind of community, you will get put back in your box pretty smartly. And I've certainly had doctoral researchers who've had that experience, even though I've said don't put it in that journal. They've gone ahead because they want to speak to those readers, are passionate about wanting to say to a group of readers, particular scholarly community, look, here's another way of thinking about it. Here's another way of writing. You don't have to write in this kind of style. Have a look at this, and it just comes back. So, starting out, I think finding journal communities that are going to be sympathetic, that are going to be keen to actually hear what it is you've got to say is important. And the old advice, I think maybe Barbara and I might have started out with this advice, but, is look at the journals that you cite most, because you're already part of that kind of journal community. You're actually already part of the conversation. You just haven't opened your mouth to speak yet. So that's a kind of key thing, I think, to finding out what the conversations that you know about already. You know, in kind of posh academic terms, we talk about journals as discourse communities. And these communities have their own expectations, their own kind of conventions and rules, and they expect to see things addressed in particular kinds of ways. And, you know, the good thing about it is sometimes there are things you don't need to do as well. So if I was writing, for example, for a Journal of Inclusive Education, and I was going to write a paper about bullying, I wouldn't have to explain that bullying was important and it actually made kids really miserable, because everybody who reads the Journal of Inclusive Education would take that as a kind of given. You know, everybody knows that bullying makes kids miserable, and it's not okay. So, you know, there are some things that you can take for granted in particular kinds of journal communities. And there are things that people often texts that people often talk about in common, language that people use that signals that they're part of the community, and a publication broker, somebody to talk to about where you're publishing and what those kind of hidden rules are is actually really helpful. When you want to find out about a journal community, I think it's really important to actually do research outside the mission statement. So actually have a look at the editors, have a look at the editorial board. If you haven't got a clue who any of those people are, then this is probably not the journal for you. And, you know, think about the editorial board is often quite interesting to look at because they're likely to be reviewers. So very often journals, there are a few journals in education that it's only the editorial board that reviews, but very often journals will try to get an editorial board member plus one other person to do a review, or the editorial board will cast a deciding vote quite often when there are contradictory reviews that come in. The editor might ask a member of the editorial board to make a decision, to review and make a decision. So you've got to think about the editorial board as the kind of inside members of this discourse community. And you can actually find out quite a lot about the journal just by having a look at those people and the work that they do, and understanding the things that they're concerned about and the kind of literatures that they read. So, you know, that in choosing, these are the ways that you choose. I think you don't choose necessarily, as I've said, on ranking. I think you choose the group of people who'd be interested, and sometimes you actually don't know who would be interested, particularly if you kind of early on, you know, and that is something that other people can help you with. You know, if you get into some conversations, if you go to not kind of online things like this, but, you know, research centre conversations, for example, and you ask to have some conversations about publication with some more senior members of your research centre, then it is highly likely that they're going to be able to say to you, oh, X would be really interested in that, or that's an angle that people would be interested in, or I can't think of anything that's been written on that, you should write something on that. Those kind of conversations are really helpful if you can actually be proactive in trying to get those to happen. And of course, I think always looking out for the predatory journal. And these days, this is getting a little more difficult as more and more open access journals are being set up. Some open access journals actually look pretty legit until you get to the point where they ask you for 3,000 quid. Whereas, you know, there are other journals that ask you for 3,000 quid, which are legit. So actually having kind of ways of understanding and working through how it is, you know, what's a reputable and trustworthy journal is important. And I think the message here again is, if you're not sure, ask a senior person in your research centre, your school, online, you know, in a Facebook group, on Twitter. Ask if people have heard of a particular journal. We do that all the time. I think it's really important that we kind of share this information. There used to be a really helpful list called Beale's List, which listed, or was run by a librarian called Beale, who used to make a list of all the naughty journals, but that's stopped now and is not is just not available. So, you know, we have to find other ways, and this kind of think, check, submit process is what we all now have to do. So, you know, when you're looking at the journal, I think, and you're deciding how to pitch what it is you've got to say, you have to have a point to make. You know, you have to ask these kinds of questions. I've talked about these already, and it's part of the kind of process of researching the journal. I'm sure these slides are going to be available to you in one form or another afterwards, and you can come back and look at them if you want to. I think it's next actually helpful thinking about the journal to understand why papers get rejected. And some of you asked about rejection, and I think this is the kind of key thing. There are available a few on some of the journal websites, I think on Taylor and Francis, and I think on some Sage journals there are, and also I think Emerald have probably got some of this advice up as well. But there are journal editors that often make videos or write about why it is that papers to their journal get rejected. And by far the biggest reason is that it's been sent to the wrong journal. In other words, you haven't judged the discourse community and its concern correctly. And I used to be an editor of educational action research for quite some time, and I can't tell you the number of papers we used to get that weren't action research. So, you know, it's a fairly sort of basic thing really, but it can actually be quite tricky working out at the kind of fundamental level, is this paper action research or not? But when it gets to these kind of territorial disputes, that's where it can get quite tricky, whether you sent something to the right or the wrong journal. The second major reason actually relates to this kind of question of argument and structure, which is really that the papers often have a confused argument, or they have more than one point that they want to make. And basically a journal article in essence makes one big point. It's a kind of take-home message. It's, you know, it can be summarised in that surname, date, says, the one sentence. That's what the journal article does. And of course it will be embellished and it'll be nuanced and evidence, but basically it's got one thing to say, and that a big point to make. And the big point is usually something that's got an interesting angle to it. It's an angle that somebody else perhaps hasn't taken. It's got a degree of kind of novelty within the journal community, and it's important there again to understand the community. So, you know, I can remember very well a kind of paper coming into Education Action Research, which came in from an Eastern European country. I won't name it, but was about the introduction of Western teacher education methods, and moving away from kind of Soviet-style teacher education. And the conclusion of the article was that of the Action Research Project was that reflective practice was a good thing. Now, was a good process for teacher education. Now, of course, you know, in Western context, this is a kind of base level expectation of teacher education and a lot of professional development that is based around the notion of reflective practice. So this argument wasn't novel. What the person, that would have been novel in their own context, in their own country, that was important. For an international audience, the angle was basically about what happens when you introduce Western teaching methods into a kind of post-Soviet context, and what are the kind of issues around that, and is this necessarily an all-you-butte kind of thing to do? So there was a potential paper in there, but that kind of angle, that different angle, hadn't been thought of because the writer hadn't thought of the audience that they were actually addressing. So the angle and the novelty come really from thinking about what am I writing about, and what is it that the readers are going to be interested in, and that might be significant in relation to what I'm writing about. And then really, once you've got the point, you actually have to think about the context that this is being written in and how you're going to build up the case. You know, if that's the answer, then you've got to construct the problem for which this answer is logical, and then carefully go through the evidence in order to reach that. And that might mean you're kind of, you know, writing in a standard social science style, or it might be that you're writing in something which is looser and a bit more experimental, but nevertheless that kind of process of I've got something to say and it's related to a particular problem or a puzzle or a difficulty in the literature or a policy that's, you know, up the creek or whatever. You've got to kind of start there relative to the answer. So the kind of answer problem is really the beginning of the way to think about the structure of the argument, and how it is that it's got to be staged or choreographed within the paper. It's also obviously important that you recognise all the work that's gone on before. You know, I've just reviewed a paper about academic writing, which in fact had, you know, I mean, made quite an interesting case about the need for looser academic writing, less conventions, whatever, you know, wanted to write a bit of poetry. But the person obviously hadn't read any of the literature or any of the conversations that had been going on for the last 40 years. And it couldn't be actually published as it was, because it was if this person lived in a kind of bubble away from what else had been not happening, not only in the journal, but actually in the kind of discipline more broadly. And of course, the other thing that knocks papers back is if they're really badly written. But generally, that's not the major kind of reason. I think these days people are more generally tolerant of world Englishes. They're less finicky about saying things in particular ways. And the poor writing will generally be, you know, absolute lack of kind of signposting or logical structure. You know, you actually can't follow what it's trying to say. It's just structured so poorly. So, you know, I think they're the kind of key things about structure. I'm really aware that we're kind of getting pretty close to the end of time, and I am just going to call this to a kind of halt with just talking about critique. So can you just perhaps tell me these answers to these questions before we go any further, and then we'll go on and talk about critique, and then we'll wind it up. Okay, so quite a lot of you have had the experience of the revise and resubmit process, and half of you have published a journal article, and 10% of you didn't have to revise and resubmit it, which sounds like pretty good going. So some of you seem to have had the experience of going straight through, which is very unusual. And some of you had an article rejected, a reasonably low number of you. I've had papers rejected, let me tell you. Everybody I know has had papers rejected. It happens to all of us. And it's, you know, it's a difficult thing when you actually get rejected. And it's obviously the case that this is just how we do scholarly work, that the process of critical interrogation is part of actually the process of making sure that our results stand up. We get other people to look at them. But we also, I think, all you know, have all sorts of feelings when we get the comments back from people, and that is because, you know, ourselves are tied up so much in the writing, and you know, the advice you hear, I think about, you know, putting it away for a few days, screaming, running around the block and all that stuff. That's all very sensible if you get some kind of response from a journal that's pretty negative. And, you know, it is the case that not all reviewers are kind, and not all editors actually monitor the reviews that they get. And of course, different people respond to rejection in different kinds of ways. You know, and I you know, I'm particularly fond of this bit of T.S. Eliot, which I think does, I guess, sum up some of what we often feel in relation to reviewers, you know. And I love this, you know, the eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase. And when I am formulated, sprawling on a pen, when I am pinned and wriggling on the wall, then how should I begin to spit out all the butt ends of my days and words? And I think it absolutely sums up some of that kind of sense you have when you're actually looking at what it is that reviewers have said about your work. I think the key thing to remember is that revise and resubmit's not a no. You know, the reviewers have seen something in your work, there's some more they want you to do, it's a pain, but nevertheless, it is an invitation to keep going. Again, get somebody to help you crack the reviewer's code, because reviewers do speak in tongues. You know, there's a kind of often a set of euphemisms or a set of vague things they're trying to say to you. They may not be explicit and helpful. Sometimes reviewers say, you know, oh, you should read this and this and this and this, and you should do this and this and this. And if you do that, you'd be writing, you know, 4 different papers with, you know, of all of them over links. And so actually working through some of that stuff, again, is helpful to do in conversation with someone who's a more experienced writer, and remembering that it's okay not to do everything the reviewers say. But if you don't do everything, then you do need to be able to kind of make the case, as you show the editor how it is that you've addressed some of the concerns. I think it's also important to understand that sometimes a revise and resubmit actually does mean doing more than a bit of tinkering around the edges and a bit of adding in a paragraph here and there. Sometimes you actually have to do quite a lot of work on restructuring and rethinking about the paper in order to make it more convincing. And it's always helpful, I think, if when you get the revise and resubmit and somebody says this and you think, I didn't say that. Now, how on earth do they get that? To actually step back and say, what is it that in the paper that actually led them to this mistaken conclusion, and how can I reformulate this so that the next time they look at it, they don't make the same mistake or the same kind of misreading again. So I think revise and resubmit is normal. It's like corrections in a PhD. This is the norm, and in most of the time, it's reasonably productive. And a lot of the time, you actually end up with a better paper because you've covered a few more bases, you've included a bit more literature, you've got a bit more nuance, you've clarified a few things that were a bit ambiguous, and the reviewers have actually done you a service as they do so, as they go through the kind of process. So I'm just going to stop there. I'm just going to go through, sorry, we left the book proposal, just to a few things that I think are reasonably helpful. Sorry, I've put my own book up there so large. It was sort of the way it ended up. But you can see here the book by Helen Cara and Janet Salmons, Publishing from Your Doctoral Research. The same line is a book by William Germano called From Dissertation to Book, 2nd edition. Anyone who's wanting to convert the PhD to a book, this is really good advice. Bill Germano used to be the director of publishing at Routledge and then went on to a university press, really experienced, sensible advice. If you're writing a journal article and you like a kind of structured workbook approach, Wendy Belcher's writing a journal article in 12 weeks is one way to actually get one set of strategies that you can use. And Wendy's got a Facebook page where she also provides advice and support based around this kind of approach to the journal article. And you'll also find some presentations from her and other people online. So these are kind of structured approaches that will take you through processes of writing, the publication plan, the journal article, and some things to think about in relation to turning the PhD into a book. And down the bottom, this little thing called paywall. If you haven't seen this and you type in paywall scholarship YouTube, it's an open access documentary about the political economy of academic publishing, which certainly I think stimulates us to think about the kind of game that we're all in at the moment, to use the kind of Bourdieusian notion of the game, and I guess to think about the stakes and to think about the kind of strategies that we want to use. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to the chair.
Thank you so much, Pat. This is really insightful, and thank you for having covered what I understand as both the social and technical aspects of academic publishing. And even for someone like me who has been in the academia for a few years, that also intrigues me to sit back and think about what kind of scholars I want to be through my publications. So that's really important, and thank you so much. So we're now heading towards those questions posted by the participants. We have 23 minutes for that. The first question asked by Robin is about how important it is to publish during our PhD research, because I have heard lots of conflicting things about the expectations of academic publishing for people doing a PhD, and I find it quite daunting and I feel quite pressured to be publishing constantly.
Okay, did you say theory?
No, it's like how important it is to publish during PhD research.
Oh, during the PhD.
Yeah.
Well, I think sometimes publishing, I think first of all to say that writing during the PhD can actually be really helpful. So it might just be presenting a conference paper, but it might also turn into another kind of publication. And I think it can be helpful because it gives you a chance to try out often a piece of analysis, a theoretical explanation, a bit of statistical work, and you can kind of play with that and see how it actually works. And then when you come to the PhD, you have to write it again, of course, but you've written it once and it actually makes a lot more sense. And you've also learned things about how to do the other things. So there can actually be a good reason for doing some publication during the PhD. In instrumental job terms, it can also be helpful if you're not doing a PhD by publication, but it can also be a distraction. And I've seen both of those things. I have to say my preference is for people to publish something during their PhD if they can, but not everybody's actually in a position to do that. They actually haven't clarified the stuff until the thesis text. But there is very often something you can kind of pull out. And one of the things, it does do instrumental things. It does get you known for working in a particular kind of space. It gets your stuff beginning to be out there. It gets the CV beginning to be accomplished. But it can also take time away from the thesis. And if you get a load of rejections, that can be extremely dispiriting as well. So I think it needs to be in conversation with a supervisor or an academic mentor is what I would say. And if it becomes a burden, it's not worth it.
Thanks, Pat. I think this is important, and also this is like not to be feel pressured by peers because everyone might have different circumstances in their own research relating to not just the topics, but also methodology and the supervisors they work with, their prior experiences before they started their PhD. They all come into that. So there's no a simple universal answer to all students saying, yes, you have to publish or not.
Absolutely. And I think it is one of those things that people that end up being part of a kind of real performative sort of impulse that's put on people. You know, if you don't publish and you haven't got 10 journal articles and a book, you know, within 2 years of finishing a PhD, you'll never get a job and you'll be, you know, and I think there's a lot of really scary stuff out there. And I think it is about trying to be realistic about what you might have to do, but also understanding where your own work is up to and what you can do.
Yeah, thanks. And linking to that, another person is asking if you can talk a little bit more about publishing preliminary findings or data from the PhD.
Yeah, this is always interesting, isn't it? I think, I guess we've all heard, this is about publishing, but I guess we've all heard the stories about people who've presented preliminary findings at a conference, in a conference, and have had their work stolen. And dare I say, I've had that happen to me. So it's not just you know, PhDs and early career researchers that happens to. So there is, I think you do have to be kind of careful and not completely trusting, in which case it's better than just presenting a conference paper to actually get publishing, I think. And of course, you can get something published without it necessarily being a journal article. So you can actually write something for a professional publication, for the conversation, for the BERA blog, for example, for another blog, and that counts as a publication. Those kinds of publications are copyrighted, and there are things you could do if somebody misused your work, because it is actually out there in a kind of published sense. So, you know, having said that, I think as I said, the preliminary early results, sometimes it is good to publish those. Sometimes they are really important. You know, and I've just started a new piece of research about teacher education, and within, I think, like without even finishing all the data generation, but really just started it, I think we've already got actually a really obvious and important early result, and I think we probably ought to publish it. Because there doesn't seem to me to be any point in sitting on it. You know, we might just as well get it out there. So I think it's about whether you think it's significant, whether you think it's going to be of interest, whether it's going to help the PhD, and maybe whether it's got instrumental purposes. That would be the kind of decision-making process you would go through, and just be a bit careful about the work in progress.
Thank you so much. I think that's important. To be honest, I've never thought about that in terms of someone stealing my ideas, because I felt trusted in this academic community, or maybe because of the kind of community I am in, feeling like people always, when you present your preliminary findings to them, they always give you constructive feedback for you to help enhance the paper. But that's really a valid point to be mindful.
I think it is the case that most academic communities are like that. I think you've got to be really unlucky to have somebody wander off with your stuff. I don't think it happens that often. But I think it's as well to perhaps actually try and kind of put a marker on it in some way or another. So, you know, even if you can turn a conference paper with preliminary findings into a blog post, for instance, you know, you have got some then legitimate claim on the material.
Thanks for this advice. This highly ranked question, I think it might be difficult to answer in a few sentences, but I tell you that, and then maybe that could be something we discuss further in our podcast. So please, more comments on how the style and expectations in writing in journal writing are distinct from PhD writing.
Okay, well, I think, first of all, it's the question of the reader. That the reader of the PhD, the examiner, is looking for particular things. Half of the criteria for the doctorate is about whether you have achieved doctorateness. And that's about showing that you've made, you're very familiar with the literatures within the field, that you can design a sound research project, and that you can generate a data set and analyse it rigorously, and what you've done and how you've written about it meets kind of ethical standards, and that you're able to conduct some form of academic argumentation. So all of that is about doctorateness, and the examiner's looking for that. And so a thesis, by its nature, has to spend a lot of time talking about literature in one way. It doesn't have to be a chapter, but it's got to demonstrate familiarity with the body of work. It's also got to demonstrate, a lot of understanding around, I guess, your own epistemological positioning, your methodological approach, and the methods. So, and journals are actually not interested in that in the same way. Journal readers want to know that you've situated work in the literature, but they don't want a huge, enormous literature trawl like you do in the PhD. So it's a kind of situating the most salient work that is germane to what's in the paper, and the discussion of the research design will vary from journal to journal. So some journals actually don't require a lot about research design. Some are very exacting and require, page or page and a half, good 1,000 words. Particularly some of the US journals are very careful about research design. So some of this depends on the journal, but there are some fundamental sort of differences about what it is you have to demonstrate. In the journal article, people are primarily interested in what you've got to say. So the other 50% of the PhD, which is about the contribution, is 90% of what the journal readers are interested in. But like the examiner, they're also going to be familiar with the field, but they might have a different take on the field than your examiners had. So I think that's the kind of key thing. Sometimes you can be more experimental in a thesis than you can be in a journal article, depending where you put it in, would be the other thing I would say, is that sometimes in a thesis you can just do stuff that you wouldn't do otherwise. And I did say I'd never do this, but, in my own PhD, I had a whole lot of photographs, maps, stories, all sorts of stuff in there, which at the time, because we're talking a long time ago, at the time I wouldn't have had a snowball's chance in hell of actually getting into a journal. So the writing that I then did for journals was actually much more straight-laced than what I'd done in the PhD.
Wow. I'm impressed that you are able to summarize those big things in those few sentences. That's
what I left out. All sorts of things. That's what came to mind.
Yeah. Another question, I'm not sure if I understand it properly, but I'll let you give it a go. Do I finalize the article before I approach the publisher? It seems to be about whether you choose, if I understand, my interpretation is that whether you choose an article or a journal first before you write, or you write for a particular journal.
Yeah, I mean, I think my advice is always to write for a particular journal, rather than write the paper and then try and find the journal where it will fit. I mean, you can, of course, do the latter, but I think you do run the risk and one of my co-authors has in fact just had this experience of, you know, writing a paper and then looking for the journal, and actually it didn't fit in the journal, and it just got, you know, bounced. So it's that's the risk you run. And I think, you know, the point actually of choosing the journal first is that you need to engage with the conversation in that's been going on in the journal. So, you know, it's different if it's no, even if it's, let's take Burge, let's take the British Education Research Journal, and let's say I'm going to write a paper about some aspect of educational technology. There's been a conversation going on in Burge about educational technology, and so I need to stitch what I'm saying in some places to that conversation so that I'm building on it or contradicting it or challenging it or adding to it in some way. So one of the reasons for choosing the journal first is actually so that you join the conversation within that journal community.
Yeah, and that actually links nicely to another question, which I think you have already answered, is it important to shape literature review around the journal's key publications? And as you say, choosing a journal in advance is to enable you to join the conversations around these topics in the journal.
And as I think I said, it will also be the case that there will be some kind of key texts that people might also reference. And it may also be the case that there is some key kind of discourse, so some key terms and ideas that appear in the literatures that are most often referenced. So rather than a single text, it might actually be a kind of conversation that, and it's the way of having that conversation, the terms that you use that you actually need to connect into. So if you were going to write for the Journal of Education Policy, for example, you know, a lot of papers are going to use the notion of policy enactment, or they might use the notion of policy trajectory, and they mightn't all give the same reference to that, but they actually are likely to. And if it wasn't within a kind of, you know, if you were talking about how somebody was dealing with a policy and you didn't at least refer to that kind of idea, which has really been produced in that journal community, then you probably would get at least a revise and resubmit, I'd think, from the reviewers.
Yeah, thanks. We still have 7 minutes. There are two questions, both related to open access. One is, would you recommend using project expenses for paying Golden Access publishing? Also, what if approached journal editors for asking information about submission guidelines and no response received? They're separate. The first is about paying for open access.
Yeah, I reckon if I was in a position where I was applying for funding, I would build in, and it was a funder that would fund open access publications, then I would apply for money to make something open access. I think there's so much evidence now that open access publications get read more, and it's not necessarily they do get cited more, but actually they get used more and they're more influential. So I think I would probably do that. And in fact, these days, if I could, I would try and also get an open access book, not simply an open access journal article. And I think an open access book's about 15,000 quid, so it's not inconsiderable. But, you know, certainly I think RCUK funders, Leverhulme, maybe British Academy are probably amenable to those kinds of requests. Some of the more charitable funders, I think, probably aren't. But there's also, I think, impact and public engagement funding that would fund some of that if the academic audience is perceived as being important. And of course, they're not always, in fact, they're most often not in impact and engagement work. But, you know, yeah, I think that's a really good thing to do. I wish someone had given me some money for open access. And just remind me what the other question was.
Actually, adding to your point, for those UK-based researchers, I think including PhD students as well, if you are a co-responding author for a paper from a UK institution, you are now eligible to publish open access articles without paying fees in major publishers such as Wiley, Taylor and Francis, and also Sage, Springer, because most UK universities have signed this what they call transformative agreements with those publishers. So if you are UK based, please go to your university's website to check about these open access policies. And also other countries have similar policies as well. The other question is relating to open access journals, like what's your view for ECRs to publish in those open access journals, which usually have very quick turnaround time and they charge fees, but this person is saying he's suspicious of the quality of articles published in those journals, such as MBPI and things.
Yeah, I think in education, I think it's not the same as it is, say, for example, in medicine, or a journal like Nature, Springer Nature, for example. There are obviously now some open access journals in some disciplines which everybody understands are not only as good as, but probably better, because they're more open to scrutiny as well, and a lot of them feedback and commentary. I'm not sure in education what journals, open access journals, I'd kind of suggest. I guess the decision that I make is that I use the kind of university repository system, which is the green open access system that, has been going for a while, where you put your author copy in the university repository, so it's actually available. Sometimes I put that same copy onto ResearchGate and Academia Edu. That's the author copy, so that there's 3 places that it's available. And quite often I would try and write a blog post or do something else, do a podcast or something else about a publication as well. So I think there are ways and ways of making it open access without necessarily defying the particularly the kind of instrumental pressures that there are on early career researchers. I'm kind of really mindful of the audience. So I guess that if you kind of feel like, and the advice you're getting is that you should be publishing in paywall journals, then I think it's about repositories, and it's about finding other ways to actually communicate the results while also serving those instrumental purposes.
Yeah, I think that links back to what you have said before, thinking about your readers. Like some of those, for example, in my area, early years education, some of those practitioners might struggle to understand those academic journal articles, even if you make them open access. So using other formats, journal, blogs and instrumental guidelines and things would be more suitable for your readers, like different ones. Yeah, thanks. The other part of this person's question is like, if they approached journal editors for asking information about submission guidelines and no response received, what would you do? How would you respond to that?
I think pretty well all respectable journals have instructions and submission guidelines on them. So I think it's just mostly a question of going through the websites to actually find out the formats and the instructions. If what you're looking for is advice on whether the journal would be interested in something that you've got to say, and you email the editor and there's no response, I think firstly, I understand that that's frustrating, but secondly, I also understand that academic editors are doing this generally voluntarily, and may be in a position where they can't respond, particularly at the moment. So my advice would be to either kind of turn to someone who can work with you as a publication broker, or look at the editorial board on the journal to see whether there's anybody that you might have met, or your supervisor knows or might have met, who could actually answer the question. Because sometimes, people on the editorial board are just as able to say whether the journal would be interested in a particular kind of paper or not.
Yeah, thanks. And also, I think there's also an aim and scope section in the journal introduction where you can decide. Yeah. Thank you so much, Pat. I'm conscious of time. So thank you for all those who have posted questions to this, and the other questions which are not addressed today, we will do another podcast with Professor Pat Thompson to address those questions, and please watch out for our website for this at a later time. Thank you again, Pat, for your insightful contribution to this webinar, and yeah, I think this is the end of our event. And I will get in touch soon regarding the podcast and everything. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.